and can I welcome you to this ASPI event, the International Community and the Strategic Balance in the South China Sea. Competing claims over disputed islands in the South and East China Sea, Chinese action, particularly over the last 12 months, have led to a new crisis in this part of the world. Recent US freedom of navigation exercises and tensions recently illustrated at regional forums at APEC and ASEAN have brought this once again to the fore. At this forum tonight, we'll have a chance to talk about that subject and really delve into what is happening at the moment behind the scenes, what's driving the Chinese action and how neighbours near and far are responding to that. This event is being supported by the Japanese Embassy, and I'd like to thank the Japanese Embassy very much for being involved in this evening. And I'd like to call on the Ambassador of Japan, Mr. Sumio Kasaka, to start this evening with a short address. Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peter Jennings, Mr. Stephen Loosley, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a pleasure for me to be here tonight for today's panel discussion, which has been kindly organized and hosted by ASPI and is supported by the Japanese government. The theme of this panel discussion is South China Sea, and it couldn't be timelier. In the Asia-Pacific region, we are witnessing the rise of China and India, as well as the rapid economic development of many Southeast Asian nations. It's often said that this region is the center of world growth. However, the region also faces various potential risks to its stability, including escalating tensions between neighboring nations in the region. In the South China Sea, both Japan and Australia share huge economic and strategic interests. Majority of our exports and imports pass through the South China Sea. Also, the TPP, as a game changer, will further expand our free and creative economic sphere in the Asia-Pacific region, enabling us to soar even higher and to propel the world economy. The member states of the TPP, including Japan and Australia, will surely enjoy an expanding market through this agreement. In order to have the generation of our children and followers share such economic benefits and potential, we must make peace and stability absolutely rock solid by observing international law by all the countries concerned. In this light, we cannot help but be concerned about unilateral actions by any country that seeks to change the status quo, such as large-scale land reclamation or construction for military purposes, again, by any country. Just 2 weeks ago at the Japan-Australia 2+2 Foreign and Defense Ministerial meeting, which was held in Sydney recently, our foreign and defense ministers expressed strong concern over the recent situation in the South China Sea and reiterated their strong opposition to any coercive or unilateral actions that could alter the status quo in the South China Sea. They called on claimants to pursue territorial claims and accompanying maritime rights in accordance with international law. In this regard, they support the right of claimants to seek the peaceful resolution of disputes, including arbitration. The ministers took note of the ongoing arbitration case under UNCLOS, United Nations Conference of the Sea of the Law of the Sea, brought by the Philippines, affirming that the decisions of the arbitral tribunal are legally binding. Last year, Prime Minister Abe gave the keynote address to the Shangri-La Dialogue on the topic of peace and enduring prosperity in Asia. During this address, the Prime Minister Abe emphasized the importance of strengthening rules-based international order in the Asia-Pacific, saying, quote, "Today, the prosperity of each and every one of us is dependent on the seas of the Pacific and Indian Oceans being preserved as open, free, and peaceful. Continued protection of the sea and the air as public goods under the rule of law is of common interest to us all," unquote. These words of Prime Minister Abe not only reflect the views of Japan, but a common awareness shared by many of the countries of the Asia-Pacific. In this context, Prime Minister Abe made our stance very clear at the same Shangri-La dialogue by referring to the three principles concerning the rule of law at sea. First, states shall make and clarify their claims based on international law. Secondly, states shall not use force in trying to drive their claims. And finally, states shall seek to settle disputes by peaceful means. The statement made by Australian Prime Minister Turnbull about the rule of law was indeed encouraging. This October, he told the media that, quote, "We have to stand up for the rule of law. We have to stand up for a rule-based international order, which means that the stronger power cannot do whatever it likes," unquote. It is clear that both leaders of Japan and Australia completely agree that all countries must observe international law. I believe that we need to keep sending this clear message to all the countries concerned. And my feeling is that the US, Japan, Australia, and ASEAN countries are stepping up and voicing their concerns against any unilateral actions. Based on this awareness and on the principle of proactive contribution to peace, Japan will work together with regional partners that hold the same basic values and intentions to ensure the peace, stability, and prosperity of the region. To these ends, given the shared values and strategic interests of Australia and Japan, I feel that there is ample opportunity for our nations to further deepen our close ties. In closing, I'd like to encourage all of you to actively engage in the discussions of today's symposium, particularly in relation to the questions of what kind of order is needed and how Japan and Australia can work together to achieve enduring peace, stability, and prosperity for the region. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Kasaka, thank you very much. And we've got a distinguished panel here tonight of experts, particularly in this field. Can I please welcome them to the floor? We have Rear Admiral retired from the Australian Navy, James Goldrick, Adjunct Professor, Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Professor Ben Schreer, Head of Department Policing, Intelligence and Counter-Terrorism at Macquarie University. Miles Kupa, former Australian Ambassador to Thailand, the Philippines, and former High Commissioner to Singapore and Malaysia. And Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They'll each be speaking for 7 or 8 minutes, and there'll be time afterwards for questions. So please hold those questions until we've finished. We'll start, first of all, thank you, with James Goldrick. James.
Thanks very much. Before I start, and what I want to do is explain some of the issues that I think are in play in the South China Sea, but to make a couple of points. I'm not an international lawyer. I will be summarising and looking from a very high level, and it is extremely complicated. And I think we've reached the stage in the South China Sea where it's akin to the famous remark by Lord Palmerston about the Schleswig-Holstein question, which vexed Danish relations with the German powers in the 1860s, and he said only 3 people have ever really understood this Schleswig-Holstein business: the Prince Consort, who is dead, a German professor who has gone mad, and I, who've forgotten all about it. So, let me just look at what we have in the South China Sea. This, I think, is about the best available picture. It's from the American Journal of International Law in 2013. What it shows is the key point that's under most examination, and it's shown in red here, is the 9-dashed line, which is the scope of the Chinese claim to the South China Sea based upon Kuomintang declarations just after the Second World War, although they had their roots much earlier than this. The problem is that the 9-dashed line is ambiguous. Not so much, although it's ambiguous in actually where it actually lies in detail, but as to whether it is a claim to all features within the South China Sea that could be cast in the context of the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention and what followed before that, or whether it is a claim to sovereignty within the South China Sea. And this is the ambiguity that is of concern to many. In other documents, China has talked about concepts of blue land or blue territory. One point I would also make is if there is a problem of language, in that sovereignty and sovereign rights, as I understand it, are described the same way in Mandarin, but mean very different things in English. So this is an ambiguous claim which China has never made completely clear as to exactly what is being claimed. Is it every feature, and every feature which generates what is valid within international law, or is it this scoping idea of that this is all sovereign, the equivalent of sovereign territory? What also people should be aware of is what is generated within the South China Sea under the normal expectations of international law, which is that the littoral states will all generate 200-mile exclusive economic zones stretching from their coasts or main islands. Now, the point to note is that there are many features within the South China Sea, particularly in the Spratly Islands, which will generate a territorial sea around them if they are present above high water, but because they cannot sustain economic life, will not generate an exclusive economic zone. Arguably, there's one island in the south, in the Spratlys, Itu Aba, which is currently occupied by Taiwan, which an argument could be made that it could generate an economic life. I make no comment about the validity of that argument. What I'm saying is that's the only one which there could be an argument about. The second point is that if it is not above the water at high tide, it cannot generate a territorial sea except if it's within 12 miles of another feature. And I'll get onto that in a minute with these freedom of navigation operations. The next point to note is that an artificial installation cannot of itself generate a territorial sea. It would rely upon the generation for the natural feature which had that ability, but if it's based on something which did not have that ability, as in a low tide elevation, then it simply generates a 500-metre safety zone. So, that quick run through, I just want to make some comments about freedom of navigation and what's happened over the past couple of months. First off, I have a real problem about freedom of navigation as a term because it gets everybody thinking about merchant ships. In my personal view, the shipping lanes are the last thing to worry about just at the moment. The thing to worry about at the moment is in several steps. For the purposes of the littoral states, if China's claim is to sovereignty, it becomes a closed sea and there's the potential to exclude everybody else from undertaking activities within the South China Sea. My personal greatest worry in the long term is fisheries, because so many are dependent on that. The next is the issue of operations, and in fact I prefer the term freedom of naval operations when we're talking about particularly what the Americans do and have been doing all around the world. And I would point out to you that in the past 25 years, the Americans have conducted freedom of navigation operations, or operational assertions, as they term them, against countries as diverse as Japan and Sweden. If they don't agree with a claim, they will conduct operations. Now, first off, China and America have repeatedly clashed over freedom of naval operations in China's exclusive economic zone, because China, as with a number of other countries, has a view that military operations, particularly intelligence gathering, should not be conducted without permission in a particular country's exclusive economic zone. But all the altercations to this point have been up off Hainan or China's mainland coast within undisputably China's exclusive economic zone. What has happened in the South China Sea most recently is the Americans have conducted a different operation with a different intent. Let me bring you back to that point over these features generating only a territorial sea. Basically, if you're doing it within the law of the sea, a lot of the Spratlys are actually either within Philippine, Malaysia or Brunei's exclusive economic zone. If those features are Chinese, within the law of the sea, sorry? Yep. I'll be 1 minute more. If those features are Chinese within the law of the sea, it's the territorial sea that's the problem. And what the American operation actually was not similar to the altercations they've had before. They conducted a freedom of innocent passage without notification through territorial sea. That's what they did. But they did not conduct a military operation in the sense of doing anything other than sailing through expeditiously. They didn't operate aircraft, they didn't do anything else. And I think that's confused things somewhat. It is likely the Americans will conduct another freedom of navigation operation. If they do that, they are likely to do it around Mischief Reef, which is the only one of the 7 installations which clearly was not built upon a high tide elevation, nor, as in the case of Cebu, which is the one they just did it in, was within 12 miles of another feature. And if they do it, I don't think they will do it simply transit, they will actually do military operations, which raises things to another level.
Thank you, James. So what is China's strategy? How is it impacting on the region? And what should Japan do? To look at that, Professor Schreer from Macquarie University.
Thank you. And thank you for ASPI for inviting me back. James just said South China Sea is very complicated, and that's certainly true, but I do think that in some sense it's also fairly straightforward. I think it is fairly straightforward in terms of the challenges posed by China to the regional order. And I do think that also in this country we need to seriously start thinking about what costs we are potentially willing and able to incur to try to signal to China that there needs to be some restraints on its behavior. And let me just walk through what I see as sort of the strategic and the operational intentions for what China has done in the South China Sea. And I would also like to start by saying we focus so much on those artificial features. And yes, they are important, and yes, they're redefining the order. But China has also been doing other stuff for quite some time, such as harassing fishermen of other nations on the high seas. And just this morning, some of you might have read it, a Vietnamese fisherman has been shot dead by an unnamed foreign country. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the Philippines or Taiwan. So strategically, I think there's absolutely no doubt what China's intentions are. They are simply to rewrite the rules and to rewrite the order. Yes, the challenges or the claims around the 9-dashed line are somewhat unclear, but I think the overall picture is pretty straightforward. China claims 90% almost of the South China Sea to be a Chinese sphere of influence. That is a massive challenge to the regional security order. And it aims to establish simply a sphere of influence in the 9-dashed line. If you think that through, it is about establishing sub-regional hegemony. And I would put it to you that we are coming fairly quickly to a point where we have to think about, do we accept a Chinese claim to establish a sub-regional hegemony? Do we say that the costs are not worth it to standing up to China, which might well be a conclusion that we draw? Or do we say, no, we cannot accept that to happen because it is fundamentally against our interests? Of course, the other strategic aim of China also is to undermine US leadership. Doesn't take genius to conclude that. And yes, of course, the uncertainties about freedom of navigation exercise, or was it an innocent passage, hasn't helped. But again, it is not just about other nations such as also Australia or Japan declaring support for American operations in the South China Sea. I think increasingly diplomatic support, increasingly we will be asked, well, what else are we going to do other than supporting diplomatically US leadership and freedom of navigation operations or naval operations in the South China Sea. Because after all, I think what China is doing very cleverly is making this a test of wills. A test of wills, who blinks first, and seeing how far they can push in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And a final strategic aim, I would think, of China is to split ASEAN. I think that is quite clear, because as we know, there are some ASEAN states who are direct claimants. There are others who have some interest in the South China Sea who are not directly involved in a territorial dispute with China, and then there are landlocked countries. Now, operationally, and I just want to put this up to put this island building a bit in perspective, because as you are aware, China claims, rightly so, that other countries have engaged in island building as well. But this gives you a perspective. So we're talking about, in the case of the Vietnam, rather old 550 meter runway, as opposed to China's 3,000 meter runway that it has been building and is probably building at this point a second one of those airstrips. This is a significant difference. But even more importantly, I would like to draw your attention to a point which was pointed out by the Pentagon report recently, that, quote, China has reclaimed 17 times more land in the past 20 months than the other claimants combined over the past 40 years. So for China to claim that it's just doing what other countries have been doing as well, I think that falls short. In terms of the operational goals, I think it is about, of course, expanding the operational reach of the PLA. It is about expanding the PLA's coercive power. And of course, the PLA quite well knows that it is no match at this point of time for the US Navy. But it is not about the US Navy in terms of, reaching operational parity. It is about increasing the leverage and the enormous dominance that China already has over its many smaller neighbors in the South China Sea. And in that context, I would also want to highlight that we sometimes focus too much on military capabilities of the PLAN, and even though they are growing, and even though they are becoming increasingly sophisticated, I would think that its real asset is its Coast Guard. And if you look at Chinese Coast Guard vessels and the number of hulls that they are pumping out by the year, and the armaments that they're putting on those ships, dwarfs. They basically, no other region, no other country in the region can compete with that, and that is what China uses to intimidate its neighboring countries. And thirdly, I think it is fair to say that if China is building another one of those airstrips, it will be in a position a better position to declare and sustain an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea if it wants to. It is intimidating to speak in front of the Japanese ambassador whether Japan will and should engage in the South China Sea. Let me just quickly speculate and leave it up to him to really answer that question. Will Japan engage in, for instance, a freedom of naval operation exercise? I don't think so at this point of time. I do think that the domestic constraints on Abe are much higher than it is often assumed from taking sort of an Australian lens. Should it? I would think only as part of an allied operation, only as part of a coalition. Japan doing a freedom of navigation operation in a contested space with China unilaterally will lead to fierce reaction in Beijing, because from a Chinese perspective, Japan is quite a different kettle of fish. But I want to reiterate that this is really a serious challenge to the regional security order, and we have to start thinking quite quite deeply about what it is that we are doing, also in support of our U.S. ally. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Ben, very much. So that brings us to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. How are they responding? No one in Canberra probably knows much more about it than Miles Kupa, as former ambassador to Thailand, the Philippines, and High Commissioner in Singapore and Malaysia. Miles.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'll throw in Deputy in the Embassy in Jakarta too. Quote, China is a big country and other countries are small countries. That is a fact, unquote. That was China's foreign minister at the ASEAN Regional Forum in 2010. It wasn't very polite. I'm not sure it was totally accurate. I wouldn't describe Indonesia necessarily as a small country. But it's an indication of the attitude. Within Southeast Asia and ASEAN, there is naturally a very strong focus on what is happening in the South China Sea. Partly that's because on the part of the claimant states, concern about the status of their own claims. Partly it's strong economic interest in trade through that region. I think the broader concerns about what's happening in the region in terms of the power dynamics. So ASEAN has been concerned about it, but it's found it very difficult to act collectively, as most of the ASEAN countries think is the best way of standing up to China. Unity in strength is strength. This is because ASEAN itself is so divided. Within ASEAN, the claimant states have competing claims amongst themselves, which they haven't been able to resolve. Also, it's a reality that at least a couple of the ASEAN states, Cambodia and Laos, might best be described as satraps of the hegemon. And then we have Myanmar and Thailand, who for their own reasons are quite wary about offending China and at times are prepared to do its bend to its wishes. Amongst the ASEAN countries, they're quite divided. Now, among the claimant states, there are different positions, but this amalgam, rather awkward collection of attitudes has been manifest over the past year at several international forums. At the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, I think it was July, they did manage to get a statement which mentioned the South China Sea, saying that there were serious concerns on the part of some countries about what was going on there, the building of the land reclamation, and they were not, however, able to name the culprit. Some nameless country was doing this and they had serious concerns, or some of them had serious concerns. It wasn't what you call a really strong statement. In early November at the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting plus, which is the ASEAN Defence Ministers plus the Defence Ministers of Dialogue Partners, normally there's a statement issued at the end of that meeting, but this time they weren't able to issue one because of differences over the South China Sea. The Chinese did not want the South China Sea mentioned. The Americans' spokesman said that there didn't seem to be much point in having a statement issued if it didn't mention the South China Sea, and they said that quite a few of the ASEANs had a similar perspective. So that was really quite an awkward moment. At APEC, certainly there was discussion around the meeting about the South China Sea, but there was nothing about it in the communique, which I guess was meant to be about economic things anyway. At the East Asia Summit, a statement did emerge which expressed concern about China's actions, and the statement also expressed the hope that there would be the expeditious establishment and implementation of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. So you can see over those several meetings there was a there were efforts to highlight the issue, but not entirely successful. The divisions were exposed. Now, as for the individual ASEAN claimant states, they've taken a different tack. Philippines has perhaps been the most robust, the most vocal, and I think they've adopted two courses. One is redeveloping their relations with the United States, particularly in the security sphere, and they recently acquired, after a long gap without any supersonic combat aircraft, they acquired 10 more are coming. They've got all of those for $500 million, so they've got a better deal than I think we have, Peter. But maybe they're not quite as capable as the ones that we're expected to get. But also, interestingly, they've brought a case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, seeking its jurisdiction over the South China Sea disputes and some judgments about China's claims, which they argue are invalid. They lodged the claim in 2013. The hearings were this year, and I think only about a week ago the court said that it did have jurisdiction, that it would hear the claims by the Philippines. China says it disregards the claims, and it argues that the court does not have jurisdiction, and obviously it doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But the court has been quite careful and made it clear that it would continue to send documents to China and ensure that should it at some stage decide to become a party to the case, that it could do so. Vietnam has also been quite robust and has been acquiring some new weaponry from the Soviet Union. Well, whoops, Russia. It's also quite staunch. Malaysia, which fancies that it has a special relationship with China, or that's what its Prime Minister believes, but even there, there was a Chinese vessel, naval vessel, visited the Luconia Reef, about 150 kilometres north of Sabah, recently, and the Malaysians did come out of their shell and declare that was they were intruders. Other countries, Indonesia says it's not a claimant, and President Jokowi has stated recently that it remains available as an honest broker. One can discuss whether its interests around the Natuna Islands do amount to a claim of some sort. Singapore has called for greater clarity of China's position and an end to the ambiguity of it, to use James's word. So there are different positions there. But I think one should look beyond the intricacies of the individual positions into a more global level and just see what effect China's actions are having. It does very clearly want to be a regional hegemon. The individual countries of the region don't want to be part of that, or most of them don't at any rate. And I think it's turning the region more against China. There's greater apprehensiveness about it. And if Southeast Asia is territory to play for in the global game, then is China winning there or not? There's one perhaps small gleam of hope. I was at a conference in Jakarta last week, and somebody involved told me that there were some very discreet discussions going on about the claimant states, including China, about not a formal code of conduct, but about consultative mechanisms that could avoid real crises. At the same conference, interestingly, which was co-hosted by an Indonesian think tank and a Russian think tank, an exercise of Russian soft power. I wasn't sure they actually had any previously, but the Russians, in trying to convince us all that Russia did have very good relations with Asia, they said, we are very close to China. We have excellent relations with China. And that prompted one of the audience to put his hand up and say, well, do you think that will help you or hinder you? I think he had a good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Miles, and I'm sure the questions will be coming thick and fast very shortly. Finally, Peter Jennings, Executive Director of ASPI, looking at the implications of this issue from from the US perspective, Australia's perspective, and other like-minded allies, and the issue of freedom of navigation. Peter, thank you.
Well, thanks, Kath, and good afternoon, everyone. I would characterise the American position as being a curious mix of, on the one hand, wanting to be hands-off, but at the same time being forced into reluctant engagement. And the Washington view, at least, was presented in June this year by Danny Russell, State Department's Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, effectively, which makes him the Asia hand of the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Danny spoke at a conference hosted by CSIS in Washington, and set out really the basis of America's position, which I think kind of brings out both the hands-off and the reluctant engagement dimensions of the American position. So he stressed, well, the US is not a claimant. He said that these were maritime and territorial disputes which really were not intrinsically part of a problem between the US and China. He said quite explicitly the issue is between China and its neighbours. On the arbitration issue, which is now in front of the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Danny said, well, the US is not a party to this arbitration and it does not take a position in terms of the merits of the case. And in the same speech, he also made the observation that, as he said, it's as good a time as any to acknowledge, as China often points out, that the United States has not acceded to the Law of the Sea Convention. So basically the position of the administration, of the Obama administration, is to set out all the things that it is not in terms of the South China Sea dispute, to make very clear that it doesn't actually see this as being something that's critical to its bilateral relationship with China, and to make equally clear that it sees it as being critical to China's relations with its neighbours. And then in the same speech, when it came to the point where Russell had to move away from the things that the US wasn't doing to actually talk about the things that the US was, well, he said, we're pushing the parties to revive the spirit of cooperation embodied in the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. He quoted Rich Armitage. He said, well, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. That was the advice he gave to the Chinese. He said, in fact, this is the advice we're giving to all the claimants. Lower the temperature and create breathing room, stopping land reclamation on all South China Sea features, stopping construction of new facilities, and stopping militarisation of the existing facilities. So basically the American position at that time was, cool it guys, let's go back to the negotiating table if possible. At that stage there had already been two US overflights in P-8 aircraft of one of the territorial features, one carrying, I think, Harry Harris, the Pacific commander, a second carrying Admiral Swift, the commander of the US Pacific Fleet. And then more recently we've seen the transit of the USS Lassen in October. So this has been what the United States has been prepared to do in terms of tangible actions in the region. And I think the best that one could say really is that it reflects very limited preparedness to be involved. The Lassen transit was also quite a curious thing in as much as at the same time as almost simultaneous to the ship going through the South China Sea, Secretary of Defence Ashton Carter was giving evidence to a Senate congressional hearing in which it became very clear that he was reluctant to provide any information about what it actually was that the Lassen was doing. And it emerged in subsequent reporting from the New York Times that the White House had taken a decision to say that its senior officials should not talk about the transit in any detail at all. case of sort of don't mention the war. And again, I think what you see there is this mix of hands-off and reluctant engagement. In fact, there has been no official statement that I've seen which actually expressed in precise terms what the Lassen did when it went through the region. And it took a case of stringing together a series of leaks, or as the administration would refer to them, authorised disclosures, and press reports, which came up with a sort of a broad consensus around what the Lassen did, which was that it made a 72-mile nautical freedom of navigation operation in the Spratly Islands on a route which challenged not only the Chinese claim, but also Vietnamese and Filipino claims as well. And it did so under the rules of what it refers to as innocent passage. So where to from here? My judgment is that the US will continue to carry forward with this policy of speaking softly and carrying a small stick. It seems to me that there are some differences within the administration, most starkly presented by the view of Pacific Command versus the White House, which is really the only effective instrument of American foreign policy at the moment. With the White House obviously winning, as it would, in those encounters, and electing to take a very low-key approach. In essence, I think the headline judgment is the US does not regard the South China Sea as being important enough to get in the way of its bilateral interests with Beijing. And so therefore the speak softly and carry a small stick will continue. Looking at other countries very quickly, I agree with my colleague Ben. I don't expect Japan to undertake a freedom of navigation operation, at least this side of the House of Councillors election, the upper house election, excuse me, which will take place in the northern summer of 2016. And what this means is that I think increasingly all eyes will be on me as I take a drink of water. Excuse me, folks, I've had a day of talking incessantly at people, so I think all eyes will be on Australia in terms of what it is we intend to do and whether we will engage in a freedom of navigation operation. Increasingly, I think this will be seen in Washington as a test of Canberra's intent. And really the best thing I can say is I think there are mixed signals as to what Canberra's intent is going to be. We had Defence Minister Kevin Andrews at the June Shangri-La dialogue speaking in quite precise and defined terms about the importance which Australia puts on freedom of navigation through the South China Sea, and making the point that we exercise that routinely, but just not under the guise of media attention. We also had a very strong statement of Australian interest in freedom of navigation out of the AUSMEN dialogues which took place in Boston a few weeks ago. But we have seen nothing that actually looks like a freedom of navigation operation. And indeed, of course, we had probably for Canberra the slightly uncomfortable coincidence of the Australian vessels transiting through the region, not within 12 nautical miles of any feature, to undertake exercising with the PLA Navy in September out of Shanghai. So is Australia going to back up its rhetoric with a real freedom of navigation operation? That's the $64,000 question, and I don't really have an answer to that. In technical terms, it's easy enough. There's only two things you can do. You can fly or you can sail. That's basically the options that are presented to us. But you can see how the argument or the debate is going to play out over the next few weeks. On the one hand, if we do, we will have hand-wringing from the how will it play in Beijing lobby, who will presumably be concerned about the impact on the bilateral relationship. On the other hand, if we don't, I think this is going to increasingly risk the perception in the United States that we are not going to support them in their own exercise of freedom of navigation. If we get to that point, and I'll conclude on this, here's the rub. It will have been only the United States which has been prepared to undertake a freedom of navigation exercise, which will make it possible for China to then to say, it's not about us, it's not about the region, it's just the Americans. And the effect of that, I think, will do enormous damage to the credibility of other countries such as ourselves, which claim that freedom of navigation is a critical strategic interest. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And as the panel gets comfortable, as you get ready for your questions, we might just start with a quick one. If the new Prime Minister Turnbull asked each of you in, which he could easily do next week, what would be the one point of advice, the one key point, starting with James, that you would like the Prime Minister to consider as this decision is made?
I think Peter's already made that. It is a matter of Australia demonstrating commitment to what it said. It is, and I think we should do this on a national basis. I differ from Ben in that, well, I think Japan, in the fullness of time, may wish to do something. I think that while it is an alliance issue in the macro sense, this is not an alliance thing to do. So I would recommend that we did it, as I've already on record saying, you don't do a press release before, you don't do a press release after, but if somebody asks you, you say you've done it.
Yeah.
Well, on top of what has just been said, I would say to him, look, you have to consider that even if we do that freedom of navigation exercise, it will probably not be enough to stop China from doing what it's doing. And they will continue to push the envelope as much as they can. So freedom of navigation exercise is not sort of the panacea, and there have to be considerations about other tools and the question of whether we would be willing to, well, as I said, incur costs or not.
Mark?
I think we should keep the subject of the South China Sea at the forefront of our discussions about regional security in our conversations with the region, but also with folks outside the region, making our concern clear. I think that can be done in a firm and responsible way, without making a too gung-ho and aggressive presentation on the subject, which I think would be too counterproductive to our relations with China. But I think it is possible, and indeed it's wise for us, because we have interest there as well, to keep it amongst the subjects that are regularly discussed.
And Peter, and do you think there'll be an answer in a few weeks?
Well, Kath, the first thing I wouldn't advise him to take out a subscription to the Northern Territory News. I think that would not be an appropriate thing to do. But I've already had the benefit via the pages of the Australian to suggest that a transit is what's needed. I differ a little bit from James's point. I would make it public, because I think that's really half the point. And I would put a senior Australian military officer on the vessel, perhaps even James actually, to reinforce the point that this is an important national interest, and it must go within 12 nautical miles of a feature on a piece of reclaimed territory, to reinforce the point that we do not recognise the territorial sovereignty that is claimed for those reclaimed bits of territory.
Which makes it mischief-free.
Some great parameters for discussion now to the floor. Who would like to start? And if you could state your name.
I'm Bill Tao from the Australian National University. First, thanks to all the panel members, very thoughtful and interesting presentations. I guess perhaps directed to our ASEAN specialist, in the sense that maybe one of the reasons that, as Peter would say, speak softly and carry a small stick, is because the Americans are somewhat confused about different signals that are coming out of ASEAN, in the context that just before Yokawi's visit to the White House, there was supposed to be some type of Coast Guard training agreement between the Americans and the Indonesians for a new Coast Guard element in the Indonesians. And because of bureaucratic strife within Jakarta between different factions of the military, it was dropped as an agenda. So it was very difficult under those circumstances for the Americans to actually project in a way that would be credible and forceful. Philippines has yet, the Philippines Supreme Court has yet to rule on the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, notwithstanding the fact, of course, that Obama was in Manila for the APEC, and actually, as I understand it, standing stoutly on a ship that the Americans sold to the Philippines not long ago, saying, we're rock hard in your corner and there should be no island reclamation, and yet, you know, the operationalization of an agreement that was signed some 14 months previously has yet to occur. In terms of the Vietnam, and then I'll stop, there seems to be this ambiguous posture coming out from the Americans. On one hand, yeah, we'd like to work with you, but on the other hand, you've got to get your human rights in order, which of course could be extended, I suppose, to Thailand to some extent. Could you clarify for us what's going on here? Thank you.
I hesitate to clarify what's going on in Washington, but in terms of Southeast Asia, I've noticed that whereas some years ago there was quite a reluctance to engage with the United States on the part of most of the Southeast Asians, I think that's changing. And you have Singapore, which is an ally, if not in name, then in practice, making its facilities available for the US fleet and aircraft. I think Vietnam is quietly cozying up to the US as well, and says it wants to have good relations with both the US and with China. I think the Malaysians have also quietly facilitated ship visits by the United States. Indonesians, I think there's some talks about training and so on going on, but it's probably a slow process. Thailand's a difficult case at the moment because it's got a military regime, but the links between the Thai military and the Americans go back quite some way, although I gather that in more recent years they've strengthened quite a bit with China. But I think that what China is doing is actually encouraging Southeast Asia to welcome the US presence in the region and to quietly do what's politically feasible to facilitate that. So what China is doing is not ultimately cost-free.
Actually, I have a question for the Ambassador. Ambassador, are you taking a question? A question then for the panel. David Rowe from the Age and Sydney Morning Herald. Probably for James first and foremost, you mentioned towards the end that the Declaration of Innocent Passage and the way that the United States had done this had created confusion. I'm just wondering if you can clarify. Do you mean confusion among the observers and the commentators?
Okay.
I'll just quickly finish. And also, if as you predict, they are going to do it again, but in a more robust fashion, I just wonder if you could explain what you think the consequences of that will be.
First off, the point about the innocent passage is it's through the territorial sea, as you're allowed to do, but without notifying the powers that have claims to that territory and thus the territorial sea, because that's a difference of opinion. There are many countries who actually say you must notify before you conduct passage. So what I think will happen next is, and there's been some, authorised disclosures? There's some indications the United States may conduct a two-ship operation. If they will do that, they'll do it within 12 miles of Mischief Reef, and they will do it in conducting operations, for example, operating helicopters, manoeuvring. If you do an innocent passage, it has to be expeditious. You aren't allowed to operate aircraft. You're really simply going from point A to point B. So it will be much more of a naval operation that they will do. The interesting thing is, how long will they do it for? I suspect they will do it in transit, but will do naval things in transit. So they're not there for that long. How the Chinese will respond, I'm not sure, because what the Americans seem to have done is hedge their bets, as Peter's made the point. They actually did as they've done with these countries before, they did the operation in relation to other countries as well. So they might well actually do it in relation to the Philippines and Vietnam and possibly Malaysia, which has a view of our EEZ operations, as well as China, to make the point about that it's about operational assertion, it's about the Americans basically stating their view of the law.
But do you think that two-step strategy was a sensible one, or did they make a hash of the first one?
My personal view is I think they made something of a hash of the first one.
Right, thank you. And
Paul Bibb, it seems to me that the issue here is the issue of close proximity naval and air operations, and that's going to get worse as China flexes its muscles more. And we've just seen, as between Russia and Turkey, what happens. We're talking of a 17-second incursion there. James, you know that Barack Obama and Xi Jinping 12 months ago signed an avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement. You might want to explain that to the audience. My view is China has no experience of that sort of thing, unlike the former Soviet Union. And both leaders, China and the United States, earlier this year, I think June, at the White House, signed an avoidance of air close encounters. So what is the chance of them actually abiding by those? And they're the only two countries that have done that bilateral deal. The second one is Taiwan and Japan have disagreements over Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands, just the same as Japan and the mainland. But President Ma told me last year that what they've done, Taiwan, is with China, is to put to one side their territorial claims, not revoke them, and agree on a joint fisheries agreement, your point about fisheries could be an issue, of go and no-go areas. Why couldn't that happen in the South China Sea?
Just take the last point first. I think for that to happen would be a very positive step. And that's where I would like things to go. In other words, there is some sort of agreement about fisheries, however it's achieved. As to the Code for Unalerted Encounters at Sea, what I should explain is that the code says certain things and gives certain directions about behaving prudently. And it's interesting, the word prudence, which of course is a very Chinese word in many ways. What actually is important about having a Code for Unalerted Encounters at Sea is it creates a mandate for both sides to actually write operational instructions for their people as to what that actually means. And what happens is, as happened during the Cold War, over the years, everybody could write the other side's operational instructions because you know that they'll only come within a certain range alongside, a certain range astern, a certain range ahead. There will be things they won't do. What does seem to have happened so far between encounters between American ships and Chinese since the signing of the agreement is that the behaviours have generally been good. Lassen, I think, had no problems about the Chinese that she encountered. One of the worries, and indeed Ben's touched on it, is that whether the Chinese Coast Guard is in this Code for Unalerted Encounters at Sea. It's not formally. One would hope that they are thinking that they are and are writing their operational instructions for their people so as to avoid accidents, because as the implication that Paul is making is inexperience and lack of clear operational instructions lead to accidents. If you have clear guidance from your boss that you're not to go within a certain range on a certain bearing, that's a great way of not having something stupid happen. So the question is whether China has written those operational instructions. It would seem they have, but whether their experience levels are enough to understand them. And I'll also make the point the American experience levels are not what they were during the middle of the Cold War either.
we've got a question here, and
Kath, I might just add, if I can, to Paul's second point about so why not, wouldn't it be sensible to sort of contemplate, joint fisheries approaches and things of that nature? I think the fact that that's not happening is as clear an insight as you can get as to what China's broader strategic intentions are, which is to say the region and the South China Sea is not for sharing. You know, you'd think any read, the sort of assessment that our own Prime Minister has made about this is counterproductive behaviour on the part of the Chinese, I think underestimates what is a clearly thought through strategic objective from a Beijing perspective.
Before the next question, we just have a show of hands of others who want to ask questions. We might just get some quick comments after, so we might have 3 comments to answer. Ben, thank you. Starting. Yeah.
Thank you. Ron Huskin, Australian National University. One quick observation about Kevin Andrews. In addition to the reinforcing the US message with an Australian ship passage, at a speech in January in Melbourne in the Q&A, he pointed out that for 30 years Australia's been conducting long-range maritime patrols in the South China Sea under the 5-power defence arrangements and sharing that information with Singapore and Malaysia. And he pointedly said, we don't intend to change the pattern of those flights in any way whatsoever. And I think what he's saying, that if people got fussy about their claims, if you like, they may question where this aeroplane, how the flight paths of these RAF flights. So that's an option for Australia, if you like, additional to an actual ship passage. The other question is getting to the point Peter just touched on. Relatively speaking, Beijing is a black hole in this question. We have so, compared to the richness of our knowledge about where the US is coming from, where the arguments, the balance of power within Washington for this position and that position, we know zilch about similar things in Beijing. And one of the things that really puzzles me is you have to imagine that in the last 30 or 40 years, Beijing has repeatedly walked up to this South China Sea question, the Politburo that is, and said, are we still okay here? Can we get to where we want to go? That's a separate question. At an acceptable cost to China's overall interests. And repeatedly the answer appears to have been yes, it's okay. We can stay well away from conflict, but we can find different ways of suppressing the opposition. It may take longer or shorter amount of time and so on, but the answer has been we're okay, the policy is fine. I suspect that somewhere along the line somebody got to the Politburo and said, the folks around you haven't been telling you the truth. In fact, this is going to be a very costly exercise for overall Chinese interests. But we're now 30 years into overt declaration of the policy. So much is at stake, we have to make it work. We have to pay whatever price comes along in order to make it work. And that seems to me the awful dilemma that we've stumbled into, that China has belatedly realized that the price it's going to have to pay to make this policy stick is very high, and in fact dangerously high, because the US has come in, Japan is looking for a way to be responsive, Australia's thinking about the same thing, and that, it seems to me, kind of the core of the policy dilemma. How do we factor that into our thinking about ways out? Because I suspect that Beijing is saying, I wish we weren't where we are, but we can't possibly back out now.
Thanks, Ron. And before, we might get Brendan to quickly ask his question, because we'll come back to that. Brendan, just quickly to it.
Thanks, Brendan Nicholson from The Australian. Look, Ron has actually opened up the question I was about to ask, and that is, like in a country like Australia, where we change governments and prime ministers from time to time, we also quite quickly change the messaging, the nuancing of relationships with our neighbours and with the region. To what extent is China's determination to proceed with this strategy actually embedded in serious Chinese policy? You know, what would it take to actually change it? Are they actually completely wedded to it, or could they be warned off it? Are they likely to retreat from it?
So they do dovetail well. So Peter, quick comment on that?
Well, I mean, Ron's point about the black hole in terms of understanding leadership intentions is true. I mean, I take a slightly different read on some fairly fragmentary sources of data, I guess, about what I think is happening in the Beijing context. I mean, the first was the speed with which President Xi assumed chairmanship of the Central Military Commission, and the view that he's been probably the most powerful Chinese leader in terms of control of the PLA. The second is the steps that he's taken in two areas, one on cyber and one on South China Sea, to essentially centralise decision-making under him in ways which I think reduces the potential for activity in the South China Sea to be attributed to just South Sea Fleet misbehaviour or lack of adequate training on the part of the Coast Guard. And those two things lead me to believe that what we're seeing here is a deliberate unfolding of a policy intent which has changed from 2012 on. And here I now move into even more speculation, which is to say that I think a big driver of the pace of the construction and the other things that we've seen was a calculation they took that there was a window of opportunity that China could benefit from a relative level of US disengagement in the issue. And you'd have to say that from every sign that Washington has given, including the Danny Russell speech I quoted, right up to the Lassen transit, that wasn't a bad read of where Washington was in terms of its own thinking. So I think the Chinese calculation was to say there was more to be gained by physical assertion of control over those territories in the last 2 years of the Obama administration than was to be gained by pretending to be interested in the legal claims of the different countries and negotiating with the Southeast Asians.
We are towards our closing stages.
Just one additional point. I think I agree with Peter. I think we say, oh yeah, we don't understand what the Chinese are a black hole and we can't read them, which I think is true to some extent. But I think we also need to think about what is it that we really want to know. And I think if you, for instance, read what's coming out of China daily newspapers, even the English version that I can read, I think it's quite clear what the message is. It's repeatedly now being talked about the South China Sea as a core interest of China. And I think it's quite clear that Xi Jinping has, as in China, well, he has tight control over the military. And if you see what they're doing in the South China Sea, I think it's quite clearly a concerted political military effort. And what I also would want to put into the discussion is sort of different concepts of rationality. I agree, Ron, with your point that we think that from a Chinese perspective, China cannot have an interest in conflict. That might be true, or that is certainly true when we're talking about the US, about Japan, about Australia. But I would posit to you that under certain circumstances it actually makes sense for China to escalate a conflict, for instance, with Vietnam, calculating quite well that no one will come to the support of Vietnam, just stating the obvious, like, oh, we are concerned, we call on all parties. And they tell the Vietnamese for everyone to see another lesson. So I would think that China plays this game very carefully, very sophisticated in terms of imposing costs on smaller powers.
Thank you, Ben. James and others, could you hold your last comments? We'll take the last question from here and then final comments.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm from the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My question is actually for Professor Schreer. You mentioned that it's becoming apparent to you that China wishes to split ASEAN. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on some trends that you might have observed in this area and why you think it might be in China's interest to do so.
He's obviously the much better expert. I just observed, over the past few weeks of China, for instance, when ASEAN, somewhat surprisingly, agreed with the Americans to elevate their relationship to a strategic partnership, including security, which is actually quite a step sort of conceptually for ASEAN countries, the very next day, the Chinese put up a new initiative, a 7-pronged approach, where they again urged, all external troublemakers to stay out of ASEAN. But they not only did that, but they provided Malaysia with quite an interesting economic package with, again, no strings attached. And they did that with other ASEAN countries as well. So I do think they're playing quite a sophisticated game again, where they simply, tie economic benefits, economic cooperation, to what they hope for in return is sort of political support. Whether that works or not depends, of course, on those individual ASEAN countries to stand their ground. But it is very difficult for a number of ASEAN countries, particularly the landlocked, like Miles has said, Laos, Cambodia, increasingly, and Thailand. If you see how China is strategically using and building of new railways, that is very strategic, that is very sophisticated, that is very attractive for these countries.
Thank you, Ben. Now, as Peter moves to the lectern, James and Miles, just final thoughts?
Just a final thought. The other indication to back up both Ben and Peter of what China's been doing is the industrial scale of the artificial land building effort. Now, my suspicion is that there was another window for Xi Jinping in terms of the economic downturn. It may be a form of Chinese New Deal for employing assets which might not have been getting work. But there's no question, in my view, that that has central direction, and that's a national commitment. It's a national project. It is not the old dilemma of whether this was a provincial Hainan drive versus central Beijing, or particular factions. That's a national effort. And finally, just the day I joined the Navy, it's an irony, the 22nd of January 1974, the Sydney Morning Herald headline was "China presses island claims," because a week earlier, China had ejected South Vietnam from the Paracels.
So it's all your fault.
Yes, all my fault.
Final thoughts, Miles?
Yeah, I'll just add that while China does, I think, regard quite a few of these countries with some disdain as not being very significant, we do have an ASEAN of, 600 million people, and total ASEAN GDP of, 2 or 3 trillion, and one of the few parts of the world that's growing. India is also interested in Southeast Asia, along with the rest of us. And how wise is it to continue this incremental assertion of dominance? And if there were to be a clash of the kind that you posit, and I wouldn't exclude that either, there is an emerging, notwithstanding the differences among the ASEAN countries and their own individual national interests, there is an emerging kind of ASEAN sensibility of community even, and I think to have that turn against China in a more vigorous way, I question whether that really would be in China's interests, and whether somebody in the black hole or whatever it is in Beijing might not notice and begin to think about it.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in ASPI's discussion. And Peter Jennings, to close off. Thanks, Peter.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the more I think about it, the more I think the solution rests with putting James Goldrick in a boat and asking him to close off on that career-long interest he's had in security in this part of the world. Clearly, this is not a debate that's going to go away, and in fact, in many ways, one of the things I think that's interesting about it is its potential to very quickly lift into a higher level of seriousness as far as regional security is concerned. So, day to day the headlines might be about the Middle East, but fundamentally there is a deep strategic issue at play in the South China Sea. I could have ended my comments to Ron by saying, if the Chinese made this assessment about how the Obama administration was going to react to their quick land reclamation, were they right? Have they finally pushed even the Obama administration to the point that they may wish to take a different strategy? I think that remains open to be seen. And I think it's very clearly the case that whatever administration arises out of the next presidential election, that we will find a different and more engaged American policy in the future. So it just remains for me to once again thank the Embassy of Japan for their kind support in facilitating putting this event on. Very grateful for that. To thank our speakers for their insights. To thank Kath for her well-timed facilitation. Quite remarkable to keep all four of us to within 7 or 8 minutes. And to ask all of you to now join us for a drink outside. But before we move, please thank our speakers. Thank you.